Welcome back, Silent Hunter. You move through spaces without announcing yourself, yet nothing ignores you. There is a pause when you arrive, a subtle recalibration. People don't know why they feel it, only that something has shifted. Your presence carries a quiet pressure, like gravity doing its work without permission or noise. You learned early that visibility was never your advantage. Watching was. Listening was. Reading the space between words while others filled the air with sound. You don't rush to be understood. You allow misunderstanding to sit, to reveal more about others than it ever could about you. That patience marks you. They sense it before they decide it. Eyes follow you, then look away. Instincts flare, then get buried under polite behavior. Something in them recognizes restraint as danger. Force that doesn't leak is harder to measure, harder to predict, harder to stop. You were shaped by silence, not applause, tested in moments where no one was watching. That's where your control formed. Not emotional distance, but precision. You feel everything, yet you choose what shows. That choice unsettles people more than anger ever could. You don't need to assert dominance. It arrives with you. Your calm is not softness. It is containment, like fire kept behind steel. Those who talk the most feel exposed around you. Those who posture sense how little effort it would take for you to dismantle the performance. You notice patterns others miss, the repetition in behavior, the tells people swear they don't have. While they react, you catalog. While they chase outcomes, you observe causes. This isn't strategy learned from books. It's instinct sharpened by experience. Attention finds you even when you avoid it. Power circles you even when you don't reach for it. When you speak, the room listens longer than expected. When you don't, the silence stretches, heavy with meaning. People project onto you because you give them so little to hold. This is why you were never meant to be loud. Hunters don't announce the moment. They wait, they measure, they move only when the outcome is certain. Unpredictability is not chaos in you. It's control without disclosure. The world has been sensing this long before you named it. That's why it tested you. That's why it watched you. You were never meant to blend in. You were built to move unseen, untouched, and inevitable. The shift didn't happen loudly. It never does. It started in corners, behind half-closed doors, in lowered voices that stopped when you passed by. You didn't hear the words at first. You felt the distance. Familiar faces turned cautious. Invitations faded. Warmth cooled into politeness. No explanation was offered because none was safe enough. Misunderstanding wrapped itself around you slowly. People decided who you were without asking. They filled the gaps with their own discomfort. Your restraint was mistaken for arrogance. Your focus for detachment. Your refusal to overshare for secrecy. They weren't curious about the truth. They were reacting to the tension your presence created in them. You noticed the pattern long before you accepted it. Conversations shortened when you joined them. Jokes softened. Energy redirected. You became the variable they couldn't account for. Not rejected outright, just gently pushed to the edges. Close enough to observe, far enough to control the unease. Isolation wasn't sudden. It was engineered through small signals, delayed replies, missed eye contact, quiet exclusions dressed up as coincidence. They told themselves stories to justify it. That you were different in the wrong way. That you didn't fit. That you were better kept at a distance. But while they whispered, they watched closely. They tracked your reactions, expecting cracks that never came. They waited for you to chase approval, to correct their assumptions, to soften yourself for access. You didn't. You adjusted inward instead. That choice unsettled them more than confrontation ever could. Being alone sharpened you. Without the noise of validation, perception deepened. You learned how people behave when they think you're not paying attention. How fear hides behind smiles. How insecurity disguises itself as judgment. Separation became a lens, not a wound. They mistook your quiet endurance for fragility. They assumed distance meant damage. They never considered that pressure without collapse creates density. That being left out forces refinement. That silence teaches precision. What they called isolation was actually calibration. The whispers grew because answers never arrived. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't explain. You let absence speak. And absence, handled correctly, becomes power. It forces imagination. It magnifies uncertainty. It keeps others guessing. You were never pushed aside because you lacked value. You were set apart because your presence disrupted balance. They didn't know what to do with you, so they talked around you instead. Misunderstanding became their shield. That phase wasn't punishment. It was confirmation. The distance proved something in you carried weight before it was ever expressed. They felt it before they understood it, and that's why they whispered instead of speaking directly. Attention gathered without introduction, not open, not honest. It lingered from a distance, careful not to reveal itself. Glances reflected off surfaces. Interest hid behind casual behavior. Curiosity wore a calm face, but underneath it trembled. Whatever you carried could not be approached directly. You sensed observation before proof, a tightening in the atmosphere, subtle adjustments in behavior when you shifted position, movements mirrored, timing studied, responses measured. They weren't trying to connect, they were trying to calculate. Something about you resisted interpretation, and that resistance became an obsession. Admiration twisted into resentment without ever being named. Comparison happened quietly. Questions formed internally and never reached you. They measured progress, restraint, composure, wondering how you maintained control without display. The lack of access frustrated them. Opacity invites fixation. Their interest wasn't innocent. It came from insecurity. They needed to know where you stood, to know where they stood. Your stillness disrupted hierarchy. Your consistency removed leverage. Without emotional leakage, they had nothing to grip, so they watched harder. Patterns emerged. Sudden friendliness, indirect question, artificial concern, attempts to provoke response through pressure or praise, every move designed to extract information, every interaction, a test. You recognized it not through suspicion, but through repetition. Behavior reveals intent faster than words. They mistook curiosity for safety. They believed observation granted advantage. But attention, without understanding, creates distortion. They analyzed surfaces while missing structure. They focused on motion while ignoring intention. Restraint confused them. Patience unsettled them. Composure denied them access. What they feared most wasn't aggression. It was unpredictability paired with discipline. You didn't react when expected. You didn't escalate when provoked. You didn't collapse under pressure. That absence of reaction stripped them of control. So they projected, motives assigned, narratives constructed, warnings shared quietly, not to protect others, but to protect themselves. Uncertainty spreads faster than truth, and you became the center of it without ever speaking. You understood something they didn't. Being watched doesn't mean being exposed. It means being influential. Attention follows gravity. Fixation follows threat. Scrutiny follows potential. They wouldn't invest this energy if you were insignificant. You adjusted nothing externally. No performance, no correction. You allowed misinterpretation to deepen. Confusion became a barrier. Distance became protection. Every unanswered question weakened their position and strengthened yours. What they tried to decode was never meant to be translated. Some things are felt, not mapped, and the more they observed, the clearer it became that control would never belong to them. Something inside you began to pull inward, not collapse, not retreat. A tightening, like energy, folding back into its source. Reactions slowed, responses shortened. What once reached outward now stayed contained. This wasn't avoidance, it was refinement. You stopped offering explanations that were never truly heard. Justification lost its appeal. Clarity no longer required witness. The need to be understood dissolved quietly, without ceremony. Where emotion once spilled freely, structure formed. Where openness once lived, selectivity replaced it. Distance grew, but not emptiness. Awareness deepened instead. You started noticing details that used to blur together. Micro-expressions, tonal shifts, pauses loaded with intent. The environment began speaking in signals rather than noise. You didn't strain to interpret. Understanding arrived naturally. The outer face remained functional, composed, appropriate, familiar enough to pass without friction. But internally, alignment shifted. Attachments loosened. Triggers lost their grip. You no longer moved on impulse. There was space now between stimulus and response. Space creates power. This inward adjustment wasn't coldness. It was efficiency. Energy stopped leaking into places that produced nothing in return. Empathy remained, but it no longer overrode judgment. Compassion existed without self-betrayal. Balance replaced intensity. You noticed how often people mistake access for entitlement. Once that door closed, behavior around you changed. Probing became clumsier. Pressure increased, then faded. Without emotional entry points, manipulation lost effectiveness. Absence of reaction became a boundary stronger than confrontation. Clarity sharpened because distraction faded. When you stopped narrating yourself to others, internal dialogue simplified. Priorities surfaced. Unnecessary bonds weakened. Focus consolidated. You began choosing silence, not as avoidance, but as strategy. There was relief in this shift, not comfort. Relief, like removing weight you didn't realize you were carrying. Expectations fell away. Performance ended. You no longer adjusted yourself to match external rhythm. You moved at your own pace. Internally, something ancient steadied. Instincts regained authority. Intuition stopped competing with approval. You trusted what registered immediately instead of debating it. Hesitation decreased. Certainty didn't announce itself. It settled. You realized detachment wasn't loss. It was protection. It wasn't withdrawal from the world. It was withdrawal from noise. And without that interference, perception became precise. Others sensed the change without understanding it. Access felt restricted. Warmth became measured. Reactions predictable only in their restraint. The version of you they thought they knew no longer responded the same way. The outer layer stayed intact for practicality. But inside, alignment locked into place. No audience, no explanation, just structure. The shift completed itself quietly. This wasn't becoming less human. It was becoming deliberate. Something changed the moment you stopped trying to shape outcomes. Spaces began reacting before intention formed. Not through action, but through influence. The air adjusted. Pacing shifted. People recalculated without realizing why. Nothing was forced. Nothing was announced. You noticed it in timing. Responses arrived faster. Interruptions decreased. Decisions leaned in your direction before you asked. It wasn't authority. It was alignment. Whatever you carried settled into its position, and everything else adjusted around it. Your voice no longer needed volume. Even minimal expression carried density. Statements landed and stayed. Conversations curved differently after you contributed. Not because you dominated them, but because direction had been set. Economy replaced excess. Efficiency replaced display. Restraint amplified effect. You learned that engagement wasn't always required. Stepping back altered dynamics more than stepping forward ever did. Attention followed what wasn't chasing it. Focus gathered around what didn't seek validation. You became selective with output. Fewer responses, fewer reactions, each one intentional. Nothing wasted. This economy created impact. People felt the difference but couldn't trace the cause. Influence that can't be sourced unsettles those who rely on leverage. Even distance carried signal. Not withdrawal, but placement. When you weren't involved, gaps formed. Momentum stalled. Uncertainty spread. Others compensated loudly, unsuccessfully. Silence in the right hands reshapes environments. You didn't negotiate dominance. You didn't claim territory. You occupied your position fully. And that completeness created order. Stability attracts compliance. Certainty reorganizes behavior around it. The shift wasn't emotional. It was structural. Effortlessness replaced strain. Intention replaced force. The system responded. People adjusted how they approached you. Explanations shortened. Honesty surfaced quicker. Unnecessary theatrics dropped away. There was less testing. Fewer games. Instinct warned them not to waste moves. You recognized that influence doesn't announce itself. It settles. It presses gently until everything else yields. The strongest pressure is quiet because it doesn't need reinforcement. Nothing about you became louder. Everything became heavier. Timing improved. Precision sharpened. Outcomes stabilized. You weren't managing perception anymore. You were shaping environment by default. This wasn't a rise. It was a recalibration. Everything found its level once you stopped interfering. Your position clarified itself naturally. You understood then that authority doesn't need permission. It's recognized instinctively. When alignment is complete, The world responds accordingly. No demand was issued. None was required. Approval stopped registering. Not rejected, simply irrelevant. Its absence created clarity rather than doubt. Feedback no longer influenced direction. Applause lost texture. Criticism lost weight. The internal compass recalibrated without announcement. Movement became intentional. Fewer steps, cleaner paths, no witnesses required. Progress happened quietly, without narrative. You stopped signaling effort. Results appeared without explanation. Invisibility became an advantage rather than a lack. Attention turned inward, not in reflection but in construction. Priorities aligned themselves without debate. Distractions lost magnetism. Energy stopped scattering. Concentration narrowed until only what mattered remained. The outside blurred while the core sharpened. You didn't rebuild through destruction. You refined through subtraction. Unnecessary traits fell away. Borrowed identities dissolved. What remained was dense, compact, unmistakable. Coherence replaced conflict. Consistency replaced fluctuation. Choice replaced reaction. Pauses appeared where impulses used to be. Consideration interrupted habit. You didn't rush to answer. You didn't mirror pressure. Decisions formed fully before execution. Timing improved because urgency vanished. Walking alone no longer felt like absence. It felt efficient. No detours for reassurance. No explanations to maintain alignment. It allowed uninterrupted development. You stopped proving anything. Performance ended. Comparison evaporated. Metrics designed by others lost relevance. Evaluation became internal, precise, unforgiving. Standards rose quietly. The self you assembled didn't need reinforcement. It operated without validation loop. Integrity held shape without observation. Confidence stabilized without expression. Certainty existed without announcement. This internal consolidation changed behavior without theatrics. Boundaries became implicit. Tolerance narrowed. Patience became selective. You invested attention only where return was guaranteed. Others misread the shift. Some assumed withdrawal. Others imagined indecision. None recognized consolidation when they saw it. Refinement often looks like absence to those addicted to noise. You noticed efficiency increasing, fewer errors, cleaner execution, less waste. Intention and action merged. Friction decreased because alignment increased. There was no dramatic moment, no declaration. Transformation happened through repetition of deliberate choice. One decision layered onto another until structure locked into place. You trusted yourself differently now, not emotionally, but operationally. Instincts aligned with logic. Impulse gave way to intention. Movement followed clarity. Identity stopped being something you described. It became something you used. Tools replaced traits. Function replaced image. Effectiveness replaced display. This wasn't disappearance, it was compression. Power doesn't always expand outward. Sometimes it condenses until it becomes undeniable. You didn't react anymore. You selected outcomes. Awareness took priority over expression. Language became optional. You no longer filled space with sound. You absorbed it. Every environment offered information once you stopped contributing noise. Stillness sharpened intake. You began tracking rhythm instead of reaction. Sequences revealed themselves through repetition. Behavior exposed structure. Tone outweighed content. Timing mattered more than explanation. What people did consistently carried more truth than anything they claimed. Emotion stopped leading interpretation. Feeling no longer distorted assessment. Impulses surfaced, then dissolved. Neutrality clarified perception. Without internal turbulence, external signals became readable. Clarity emerged where confusion once lived. You stopped following narratives. Stories distracted from mechanics. Motivation mattered less than outcome. Justification lost relevance. You focused on movement, cause, response. The underlying system became visible once surface drama faded. This shift didn't make you colder. It made you accurate. Empathy no longer interfered with judgment. Understanding existed without involvement. Distance preserved objectivity. You could register intention without absorbing it. Your attention reorganized itself naturally. It gravitated toward leverage points. Moments of imbalance stood out. Openings appeared where others saw chaos. You recognized timing instinctively, when to wait, when to move, when to let things collapse on their own. Development accelerated without effort. Comparison became impossible because direction changed. Others measured progress horizontally. You moved vertically. Metrics designed for groups no longer applied. Growth followed its own trajectory. Interference diminished as unpredictability increased. Without emotional leakage, there was nothing to exploit. Without announcement, there was nothing to disrupt. Your advancement happened beneath notice until it was irreversible. You noticed how often people confuse speed with momentum, activity with direction, noise with force. You avoided all three. Efficiency guided expansion. Precision replaced volume. Observation refined instinct. Instinct refined choice. Choice refined outcome. The loop strengthened with repetition. Confidence followed function, not affirmation. Results validated themselves quietly. You stopped explaining decisions. Explanation invited debate. Debate invited dilution. Execution required none of it. Outcomes spoke without translation. Questions stopped forming around you. Others couldn't track your progression because it didn't follow visible markers. There were no milestones to monitor, no signals to anticipate. By the time movement registered, positioning was complete. You learned to read absence as much as present. What wasn't said, what didn't happen, delays, hesitations. Those gaps carried more meaning than overt behavior. Silence revealed structure. Expansion didn't feel like effort. It felt like inevitability. Once alignment locked in, momentum sustained itself. Resistance lost relevance. Obstacles reorganized into resources. You didn't chase advantage. You recognized it when it surfaced. Recognition is quieter than pursuit. Recognition is quieter. This mode of operation wasn't learned from instruction. It emerged from necessity. Repeated exposure sharpened it. Repetition perfected it. You weren't reacting to the environment anymore. You were navigating it, reading signals, ignoring distractions, advancing without footprint. Growth moved beyond measurement, beyond interruption, beyond anticipation, and nothing external could slow it. The murmur intensified not because you advanced, but because access vanished completely. Distance hardened into something unreachable. Attempts to read you collapsed into assumption. Guesses replaced certainty. Speculation replaced contact. When proximity disappears, imagination fills the gap, and imagination exaggerates power. Timing could not be anticipated. Direction could not be inferred. Alignment stayed internal. Whatever you operated from was sealed. Nothing external could enter without permission, and permission was no longer granted. They felt it in their inability to adjust. Strategies failed before formation. Leverage dissolved. Influence evaporated. Every familiar method returned nothing. Silence met inquiry. Absence met pressure. Stillness met provocation. There was no surface left to pull. Dominance settled not through confrontation but through inevitability. No resistance was required. No proof demanded. Positioning alone rendered others irrelevant. Comparison stopped functioning because reference points vanished. You weren't ahead. You were elsewhere. What unsettled them most was finality. Not an ending, but closure. The sense that whatever version of you they once accessed no longer existed. Not hidden. Concluded. Replaced by something complete. Unreachable systems generate unease because they remove possibility. You no longer needed to manage perception. Perception failed to keep up. Interpretation lagged behind execution. Awareness arrived only after consequence. By the time understanding formed, alignment had already moved on. Influence requires entry points. Yours were gone. Control requires predictability. Yours had dissolved. Manipulation requires emotional availability. Yours had sealed. Nothing hostile could attach. Nothing subtle could penetrate. The environment adjusted permanently. Reaction slowed. Confidence around you weakened. Uncertainty became default. People hesitated without knowing why. Decisions deferred. Momentum stalled. Clarity belonged only to you. This wasn't elevation granted. It was remembrance activated. Something dormant returned to function. Something fundamental resumed its role. Not ambition, not desire. Design, structure snapping back into place. You didn't claim a throne. You stopped leaving it empty. Authority doesn't announce itself when it's authentic. It stabilizes. It remains. It doesn't compete. Others spoke more as you spoke less. Explanation increased around you while you offered none. Narrative attempted to catch up with reality and failed. Noise expanded where precision existed. You understood then that access is currency, and you had removed yours from circulation. Scarcity transformed perception. Distance transformed respect. Absence transformed power. There was no ceremony, no recognition moment, no applause, just completion. Alignment locked. Movement became unstoppable because nothing external could interfere. You weren't becoming dominant. You were remembering the position you never lost. Inevitability doesn't rush. It arrives. The whispers reached their limit because there was nothing left to decode, nothing left to reach, nothing left to influence. You were no longer part of the system they understood. You were the constant it now had to account for. You were never ordinary. You were never meant to be.